David Cunliffe.
Seems the Minister didn't want his full allocation of time. Hardly surprising, because he didn't really defend the Minister who's lost his job at all. In fact, National's response to this very serious breach of ministerial standards has been to throw mud at the Green Party, to ignore the substance of the allegations, and to fail once, even once, to excuse, justify or defend the shocking lapse of ministerial standards which is now endemic in that National Cabinet. Mr. Speaker, Maurice Williamson is just the latest minister to be added to National's roll of dishonour. There is still room for more to come, no doubt there will be, but last week he joined the ranks of Pansy Wong, Phil Heatley, Nick Smith, Peter Dunn and John Banks. Mr. Williamson, it's a long list, Mr. Speaker, long and growing. Mr. Williamson's resignation and the issues that led to it are very serious matters that question the independence of the New Zealand Police and their ability to conduct investigations without political interference. Mr. Speaker, New Zealanders must have an assurance that ministers in any government will not, cannot, must not use their position to either favour some members of the community or to apply pressure to independent organisations like the police. New Zealanders are stunned. New Zealanders are shocked. New Zealanders are saddened that that could have occurred at all. Mr. Speaker, the fact that it did tells us a lot about the culture within National and the disarray that this government is coming into. And, Mr. Speaker, it is the Prime Minister, Mr. Key, who is directly and ultimately responsible for the growing culture of cronyism and arrogance on the part of this National Government. These are the lowest ministerial standards in a generation. A culture that the normal rules of conduct no longer need to apply. That the rules of the Cabinet Manual have become mere guidelines, that it is now allowable, for example, for ministers and their families to financially benefit from companies that they have assisted in their ministerial capacity without proper declaration of conflict of interest either to the Prime Minister or to the public. Why is Judith Collins still a minister? And that those companies, like the one represented by the donor to Mr. Williamson, have donated thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to the National Party, and that is now business as usual. For this National Government, politics is no longer any kind of calling, it is simply a business. Cash in, cash out, standards down, ministers hanging on, and the public becoming disillusioned that this government anymore represents their hopes and dreams for a better future. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has led this culture of cronyism and entitlement, not just by omission, but by deliberate act, like taking $55,000 himself from the chairman of Aurovita and then telling the public it was a donation to a charity.
That's right.
The National Party was the charity. Like reinstating Peter Dunn to his ministerial role despite the almost certain truth that he leaked a classified GCSB report. Like relying upon the vote of John Banks, who is currently on trial for taking large amounts of money and then covering it up. Like excusing the Minister of Justice after she overruled the Prime Minister and condoned the actions of Minister Williamson interfering in a police operational inquiry, not to mention the fact that it was a domestic violence inquiry, not to mention the fact that he was a wealthy foreign donor. But any intervention, you would expect the Minister of Justice to be the first to apply the rule of law and the conventions of the Cabinet Manual. But she did not. She sought to overrule the Prime Minister. Why is she still in office? That same Minister of Justice is a trained lawyer, a lawyer who is trained to identify and manage conflicts of interest but could not manage her own, who has most recently taken out her frustration by low personal attack on individual members of the press gallery. These are the standards in John Key's National Cabinet. These are the reasons why New Zealanders are losing hope and losing faith that this government anymore can represent their aspirations for a better life for themselves and their children in this beautiful country of ours, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's proper for us to briefly recall the incidents that led to Mr. Williamson's resignation. He rang a county's Manukau district commander in January regarding their investigation of Mr. Dong Ha Liu after his arrest in December 2013 on assault charges relating to a domestic incident. He told them, quote, "Ensure we are on solid ground as Mr. Liu is investing a lot of money in New Zealand." He didn't say it was investing a lot of money in the National Party, but he was that as well. And since when in this great country of ours has the amount of money in someone's bank account been able to determine their treatment under the law? That is not the New Zealand that our people want to see. That is not the country we want to build. Mr. Williamson then said it wasn't improper because he wasn't a friend of Liu. You might say they were just beach batch buddies. And that contrasts, sir, with Mrs. Collins having dinner with friends that she couldn't talk to, but saying they were friends after all. Mr. Williamson, however, had helped Mr. Liu get citizenship after it was initially declined. He held his citizenship ceremony in his electorate office the next day. He encouraged him to buy the holiday home next door. He saw the plans for it. He worked on it. How close is that, Mr. Speaker, to foreign money? Way too close for New Zealanders. And then to take that and interfere into a police investigation to get the man off a domestic violence charge, a plague that affects 1/6 of all women in New Zealand. No wonder that National Party across the way is hanging its heads low. It is disgraceful. It is not the New Zealand that New Zealanders want to build. And Mr. Speaker, very, very sadly, this is not the first occasion. First, there was Richard Worth. He resigned in 2009 after being caught out travelling to India and taking up aviation training in New Zealand, all the while operating as the director of New Zealand Aviation Limited and holding shares and directorships of an Indian trade group. Yet more undisclosed conflicts of interest, yet more cosy relationships with foreign money. It took a while, but he eventually left. Then Pansy Wong got it wrong in 2010 on yet another taxpayer-funded trip to China, this time as a private individual who witnessed her husband's business deals, signing a contract using her ministerial title, promoting her husband's... Here's one for Mr. Brownlee. Here's one for Mr. Brownlee, her husband's hovercraft business in the interests of a local Chinese website. Too close to foreign money, Mr. Speaker, a culture of cronyism setting in. It all sounds very familiar, doesn't it, given Ms. Collins' current troubles. In March 2010, Phil Heatley was sacked for much less. He lost his position when it was revealed he had charged ministerial services with expenses he was not entitled to. Or Nick Smith, sitting there, who went only to return, writing a letter of support for his friend and National Party campaigner Bronwyn Puller while a minister on ministerial letterhead. The Prime Minister described that as a lapse of judgment, but in the light of Mrs. Collins, one could feel sorry for that minister because he was treated harshly by comparison. But this goes to the culture within National. A culture of cronyism, a culture of arrogance, a culture of entitlement, a culture that the rules that apply to all other New Zealanders no longer apply to them. And there's an old rule in politics, Mr. Speaker, when that rot sets in, a government goes out.
I call the Right Honourable